welcome to Education USA Virtual Week. Education USA is your official source of US higher education information. This week-long webinar series brings you 10 live virtual sessions on different topics to help you prepare for study in the USA, and features more than 20 expert US admissions specialists and Education USA advisors. My name is Katie Sleeman, and I am an Education USA coordinator in Auckland, New Zealand. I have the pleasure of kicking off part 1 of the Complete Your Application sessions. Applying for US study is a task that takes time, as each application is different. During this session, US admissions specialists will guide you through types of applications and common deadlines, as well as requirements like education credentials and standardized test scores. This session is brought to you by Education USA, University of Richmond, and University of Tennessee. If you are tuning in live, we encourage you to post your questions on our Slido page by going to www.sli.do and entering the session code you see at the bottom of this screen. First, I would like to introduce our US admissions experts who will be delivering the presentation. Amanda Lee Gearhart has been in undergraduate admissions for the past 6 years, having worked at both a medium-sized public research university and now the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia, as Senior Assistant Director of Admission. In this capacity, she works closely with international students from many corners of the world, including Oceania, East and Southeast Asia, and Canada. Jason Martizek is the Assistant Director for International Recruitment at the University of Tennessee. After graduating from university, he taught English in China for 4 years before returning to the US to begin working in the international education field. I also want to give a shout out to everyone who's tuning in from New Zealand, Australia, and the Pacific, including those watch parties happening in Samoa. Now over to you, Amanda.
Great, thank you so much for having us. We're very excited to dig in deep to all of the content surrounding completing your application. So we know that we have a lot of ground to cover, and we hope you'll have many, many questions. But we want to start by telling you a little bit more about the institutions that we represent. You'll find through our presentation that as you complete your application, there are different requirements for different types of schools, and we're very happy to represent 2 very different types of institutions today. So my institution is the University of Richmond. The University of Richmond is a small, private, liberal arts and sciences college in Richmond, Virginia. You can see on the map there, we're located in central Virginia on the east coast of the United States, about 2 hours south of Washington, D.C. And being centrally located in the state, we're about an hour away from the Blue Ridge Mountains in the east and an hour away from the beaches in the west. While we are in Virginia's capital city of Richmond, we are not an urban campus. You can see the pictures below. We're a very green, suburban, safe campus for our students. And we're very happy to welcome about 10% of our students as international students. They represent communities across 60+ different countries. So Richmond is really a place where you'll get to learn from many different types of students and meet peers from all across the world. With 3,000 students, our average class size is about 16 students, so you'll know your faculty as well. And we also offer a huge range of programs in that we are a liberal arts and sciences college. So we have your traditional programs like biology, psychology, English, all within our School of Arts and Sciences. We do also have a School of Business at the University of Richmond for students interested in those programs, as well as a School of Leadership Studies. Our Leadership Studies program was the first of its kind in the United States, so it's something we're quite proud of. And it's about building that foundation of soft skills. What does leadership look like now, and how can we project the future of leadership? Students have opportunities to double major and minor, and they also enter into our programs as undeclared students. So that's a little overview about the University of Richmond, and happy to answer any questions about the University of Richmond as we go along.
Hello, my name is Jason Martizik. Thank you all for joining us tonight, or today for you guys. So I am from the University of Tennessee. We are located in the eastern part of Tennessee, pretty close to the East Coast, but we're right at the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, which are gorgeous. We are a fairly large university. We have nearly 30,000 students on campus. We have students from over 40 different countries represented at UT. We are a major research institution. We make research and internships a major part of studying. No matter what field you're in, we have different research centers for all of our colleges. We are partnered with the Oak Ridge National Lab. If you haven't heard of that, it is a major nuclear nanotechnology research institution that is run through the Department of Energy. A lot of our engineering and science students can sign on for a 7-month internship program working there. And being a research institution, a lot of our students get to work with a lot of the top people in whatever field they're really studying. But we offer over 360 different degree programs at UT, all the way from undergrad through your PhD programs. But as you see in the picture, we have a major football stadium on campus. It's called Neyland Stadium. It can seat over 100,000 people, and it is an amazing thing to see. My office is just next to it. But it's a really amazing campus. We are ranked 46 out of public institutions in the U.S. For some people that may be important, but it kind of depends on what you're looking for from an institution. One of the good things about UT is that even though we're a large campus, it still feels rather small. And that's one of the things you have to think about when you're kind of picking your schools is what's the best fit for you. And I think UT fits in really, really well with people who want a smaller campus, but a lot of campus activities. All right.
Great. So diving in now to completing your application. Of course, the most important question to start off with is, what is the application and what are my options? So I'm happy to talk about 2 of these 3 different types of applications that are probably going to be the most common to you. The first of which is the common application. The common application, very similar to the coalition application, in that it's sort of a one-stop shop where you can submit all this different information about yourself, about your academics, and then you can submit it to a huge selection of US universities. So you fill out only one application and you send it along to as many schools as you're interested in. So that makes it a little bit easier, of course, to apply to a handful of schools all in one click. And these are websites where you can start to build your profile now. So even if you are a student that's early on in your secondary school education, you can start to collect your activities, sort of building a digital resume so that you can be prepared when it does come time for the application itself to open so that you can submit your application.
Another type of application that you'll see is some schools that aren't a part of the Common App or the Coalition app. They will have their own individual institution application. Some schools like UT will actually have both. So we have our institutional application and a common application that you can complete. Really and truly, it's up to the students to complete whichever one they want to. If you do want to apply to a lot of different schools, the Common App is a good option. That way you can apply to several of them all at one time, like Amanda said. But I know for coming from the recruitment side, what we take advantage of more is if they fill out our institutional application, it puts them earlier into our email communication chain to where we get the students' information earlier and we can start communicating with them and ask or answer any questions they may have sooner than the Common App. The Common App, you end up being a little cut off from the actual institution a little bit. So it's something to kind of keep in mind if you do have an option to do an institutional or a Common App.
Sure. So what are the different components of the application? And what's nice about the components is that it is pretty consistent across all these 3 different types of application types. So the first is going to be the biographical information. This is where you're going to put your name, your contact information, all the things about you. And I have a call out here to particular sections, and this is specifically from the Common Application, sections that are of particular importance. Things like the language and your citizenship. These pieces are important because they often will trigger how you are read and evaluated within the greater applicant. So perhaps you're applying from New Zealand, but you have dual citizenship with the United States. This is likely going to change the way that you are evaluated within the application context. So it's important to make sure that you're familiar and aware of the different citizenships that you hold and that you acknowledge them on the application itself. The other piece has to do with language. Later on in this presentation, we're going to talk about English language testing that is often required by institutions. And so if English is your first language, if it is your native language, this is something that you'll want to make sure that you indicate on the application as well. Once you move through the biographical information, you'll move on to your educational and testing information. This is where you're going to list what school you currently attend, if you've attended any other schools, what periods of time you have been at those schools. And then, of course, you have an opportunity here to self-report your testing information. This would include your standardized tests like SAT or ACT. It may also include any AP examinations that you've taken, any national examinations. It's really open to you. It's important to know for each different institution that you're applying to if self-reporting on the application is considered an official way of reporting your testing. Some schools will allow for self-reporting just by putting it on the application itself, and others will require that testing comes directly from the testing institution, like College Board for SAT or the ACT organization. So one thing to kind of investigate a little bit for the schools that you are applying to. Next is the activities section. I know that in part 2, they're going to dive really deep into this to talk about what that entails, and as well as the personal essay. Something important to keep in mind, if you are applying to multiple universities through the Common Application or the Coalition Application, again, it's just one application that's sent to all institutions. So the activities list that you compile, the essay that you write is going to be sent to all of those schools. So again, this is another thing to consider if a school has an option of applying through their specific institutional application or the Common Application. If there's something you'd want to write that's unique for that school, perhaps you'd consider applying for in the institutional application rather than via Common Application. Other schools may also have institutional specific questions. So, for example, at the University of Richmond, we have an additional supplemental essay. So it's important to look at your dashboard if you're applying through Common Application and see if you have to submit any additional essays or short answer questions for the schools you're applying to. And then oftentimes there are schools that may have specific institutional major specific questions, or perhaps an honors program that requires an additional supplement. So this is where it starts to fall into the it depends category, and it's important to do your research as a student to see what specifically is going to be required from a supplemental perspective for each individual school. So now transitioning to talk about application plans. So there's some language that you're going to see in our next slide, and we want to provide you with some definitions now. First off, we want to talk about this idea of non-restrictive application plans versus restrictive application plans. Non-restrictive application plans are very open. You can apply to multiple schools within the same plan. You can, some of them have soft or hard deadlines. We'll talk a little bit about about that in the next slide as well. So a hard deadline, of course, being you must submit an application by this specific date, whereas a soft deadline is going to offer you some flexibility. For non-restrictive plans, you're always going to have the opportunity to review your financial aid and scholarship packaging before you make an admissions decision. And that's really important for those students where financial aid is going to play a big role in your decision. And you also have until the national deposit deadline to make your decision. For restrictive plans, you can often only apply to one or perhaps one or two schools through these restrictive application plans. There's always a hard deadline. You must submit your application by a specific deadline. Sometimes you are not able to review your financial aid package because you're asked to commit before the national deposit deadline. The national deposit deadline for schools in the United States is typically May 1st. So that means we, across the board, as U.S. institutions, have decided that we are going to give you until May 1st to decide what school you want to deposit and enroll at. This deadline does change sometimes for some institutions. Some schools will extend their deadline to give you more time, but typically we encourage a student to do enough research and have all of their application decisions in front of them so that they can make that commitment by May 1st. So I'm going to talk about a handful of these plans, and this is terminology that it's good to get familiar with. This idea of plans have to do with different types of ways that you can apply to institutions. So they're all categorized here. The first, a very common application plan is regular decision. Regular decision, you can submit by a specific date. It's usually later in the admissions cycle, so you have ample time to put together an application that you feel confident with, and it is not a binding deadline, a binding plan. So you can apply. If you're admitted, you can choose not to enroll at that institution. And you're typically going to find out your decision by a specific date as well. Jason is going to talk a little bit about rolling admission as an institution that has rolling admission available for students.
Yes, so like the University of Tennessee, we have what we would kind of call a soft deadline. That means that we do have a stated deadline for students, but after that point, we could still admit students throughout the rest of the year. A lot of that depends on the university, though, and it's good to speak with them. Normally, a school is going to give you a deadline because they need students to apply by that time. And normally, a lot of things can be defined by that date. So like at University of Tennessee, our deadline is for our early decisions is November 1st. You can still apply after that date, but if you do, you're going to miss out on applying for our honors programs or applying for scholarships and things like that. So deadlines are important, but some schools do have, like I said, soft deadlines where you can keep applying throughout a certain amount of time. Like for UT, that's going to depend on slots that we have available. So we only allow so many students per year in a freshman class. And so if by early decision, if we have, or by the decision date, if we have all the slots filled, then we may not be able to include more students throughout the semester or throughout the summer. But if there are slots available, we may be able to add more students throughout that time. So it's better that you do pay attention to deadlines and you work in deadlines. If you know you're going to miss a deadline, it might be good to communicate with whatever school you're applying to and see if you can maybe work with them to apply after a deadline. Something else you need to keep in mind as well is sometimes a school may have a general deadline, but sometimes programs may have a different deadline. So like for UT, our nursing program, December 15th is our deadline, but we have a rolling deadline after that. But for our nursing program, December 15th is it. No one can apply after December 15th for our nursing program. So it's one of these things, and you'll hear this a lot, is you have to do your research at the institution that you want to apply to. So keep that in mind when you're looking at different schools and you're keeping notes on deadlines and excuse me, and things like that.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And I think it's important to note too that we are not shy about these deadlines. So we know that it can be confusing with different deadlines for different schools. And we don't want you to miss a deadline at the end of the day. So our websites make it very, very clear about our deadlines. If you're applying through Common Application or Coalition Application, that information is also going to be there on your dashboard. So we definitely like to put this information in your hands. But moving right along, early action is going to be the last of the non-restrictive application plans. And this is very, very similar to regular decision, except that it typically has an earlier deadline to apply. So early action students will have the opportunity to submit their application by an earlier deadline. They typically receive an admissions decision before regular decision applicants, but it is still non-binding in that you can absolutely decline that offer of admission if you're admitted through early action. As we move into the restrictive application plans, you can see that they do vary whether they are binding or non-binding. Restrictive early action is perhaps the most complex plan to understand. It is offered by a handful of U.S. institutions, but it's not one of the more commonly used plans. But these students are going to be typically restricted as far as how many schools they can apply restrictive early action. So a school will say, you can submit your application restrictive early action to us. You can decline our offer if you are admitted, but you can only apply to our school restrictive early action, or only to our school through an early plan, which means that every other school you'd applied to, you'd have to apply regular decision, for example. So again, not one of the more common plans perhaps, but one to be aware of. What you will see at a number of schools though is early decision. Some institutions have only one early decision deadlines. At Richmond, we have an early decision 1 as well as an early decision 2 deadline. So there's an earlier early decision round and a later one. And this is a plan that is binding. So this means that I know a particular school is my absolute first choice school, and if I'm admitted to the school, I will enroll at that institution. It is very formalized in that you will sign a contract, your parent or guardian will sign a contract, your college counselor will all sign a contract to say, if I'm admitted through early decision, I will commit to enroll. So this plan is unique, again, in that you're going to submit the application early, you're going to receive your admission decision quite early, and you'll also see that early decision application plans typically have at least a slightly higher rate of admission. So there can be a benefit, and the benefit will vary from school to school in applying early decision. But again, knowing that it is a binding plan, this is not a plan where you'll have the opportunity to see a financial aid award in most cases. So it's important to use our price tool calculators on our websites, talk to your family about how large of a role financial aid and scholarships need to play into your decision before you commit to an early decision plan. So now talking about deadlines. So we are very sad to say that it does depend. There are some general guidelines that we share here with you today, but it can vary, and it can vary quite significantly from school to school. So as Jason said, it's important to look at our websites individually and try to keep track of all the different things. What I can say is that almost across the board, for most schools, you're going to find that the application will open on August 1st within your last year of high school or secondary school. So as you're moving into your final year of school, August 1st is when the applications are going to open, and that will be the earliest date that you can submit an application to a school or university. Generally speaking, early decision 1 or early decision deadlines, if they only have one opportunity and plan, as well as early action, are going to have a November 1st deadline. And then regular decision deadlines are typically around January 1st. So you can see early action and early decision, you apply earlier, you receive a decision earlier, and regular decision deadlines will give you a little bit more time to pull together your application and submit. When you look at the applications, or excuse me, the websites for different institutions, as Jason noted, it's important to keep track of specific program and scholarship and honors program deadlines as well. So for example, at the University of Richmond, our regular decision deadline is January 1st, but if you want to be considered for our full scholarship award, you have to submit your application before December 1st. So these are some of the nuances that you'll really only know if you do your research on our individual application pages or reach out to us individually. So lots of things to keep in mind when you're considering deadlines.
And part of applying, of course, will be submitting your transcripts. Transcripts, most of the time, if you go to a school's website, they're just going to say submit your secondary transcript, or some schools may say submit your high school transcript or your 12th grade transcript. Don't get too confused by all of that. Typically, most schools, if you submit your final year transcript, that's all they need to get started. Here's a good little display of a couple of different, or several schools from Oceania that you may be able to get an idea of what is required from the different institutions. UT, for example, we look at core GPAs, and typically we will review transcripts from at least 3 years of secondary education. So some schools, like my previous university, we only looked at the final year that you were attending, and we can kind of work with that. Some schools are more strict than others. So like we've said before, it's part of doing your research and reaching out to the institution to see what transcript they may need. But it's always a good idea, whatever your final transcript is, that should be probably the first thing you should submit. But something to keep in mind, though, is that if you did have 2 separate transcripts, if you attended 2 different secondary schools or had an upper or a lower secondary school, then you're going to need to probably submit both of those applications. But like I said, it's one of those things that you'll just have to communicate with the school that you're applying to. And something else to keep in mind is terminology that you will see on websites. You may see the words official or unofficial transcripts. Don't let this confuse you. Basically, what official means is that it's coming from an institution. It is coming from your school, not from you personally. So it won't be you uploading a document. It'll be your school either sending an electronic transcript or a paper transcript. This is one of the things that you'll just have to look at the different institutions you're applying to and apply or look at their website to do your research to see which one they need. Some schools, you have to maybe enter your GPA or your grades. It just kind of depends on how they have their application set up. Now, if you look here, so I kind of talked about core GPA. There are core subjects that could be important when you're applying to an institution. So at UT, we look at core subjects. So English classes, social studies, science, math, foreign languages. These are the types of classes that we really focus on to factor in a GPA. And for some programs like our nursing or our engineering programs, they will look at your math scores to determine if you will be eligible for entry to their program. So it's one of the things you kind of have to keep in mind. And like we said, do your research on their website and see what an individual program may require.
Absolutely. So there's definitely a nuance here in making sure that some programs will have specific requirements. What's nice about our 2 different institutions is that we can represent really the range of programming that we're looking for. So for example, at the University of Richmond and at other liberal arts and sciences colleges, we are looking for students that have really experienced a breadth as far as their core subjects, because that's what they'll be required to experience on our campuses. We have a core curriculum. We want students to experience lots of different subject areas and disciplines. And so we hope that you've really maximized the curriculum that's available to you and trying to take courses across all these different core areas. So while again, at a research institution where perhaps you're applying directly into a major, and that major requires specific focus area within your high school subjects, at a liberal arts and sciences college, all of our students arrive to our campus as undeclared students, which means you don't apply directly into a major or directly to a department. You just apply to the University of Richmond as a whole. We give you the first 2 years as an undeclared student to, as I said, try lots of things and figure out what's a good fit for you. And so we want to see that you have that foundation across all the core subjects here in order to prepare you for that experiential time at the University of Richmond and at other liberal arts and sciences colleges. So as you're reporting your transcripts and you're sending your transcripts along for us to review, students often get caught up in this idea of a GPA. What GPA do I need? How is my GPA reviewed? Is it recalculated? And the answer is, it does depend, but generally speaking, US universities are looking at GPAs typically on a 4.0 scale. We know that that is perhaps not the type of scale that you're experiencing at your secondary schools in your countries and internationally. So this just kind of paints a picture of all the different resources that are out there for us as admission officers and familiarizing ourselves with all the different scales from different regions and parts of the world. So we have tools at our disposal to be able to recalculate your GPA. Often speaking, when colleges and universities recalculate a GPA, we are looking at just those core subjects that Jason indicated. So we're looking at those 5 subject areas. We're not going to be looking at a physical education grade or a music grade, just the core subjects in order to provide a 4.0 scale. Recalculating a GPA really benefits us as admission officers so that we can look at everything kind of equally. We are able to see where students fall within our greater pool of applicants. This is also an opportunity for us to really get to know your schools very well and begin to connect with your counselors or with EducationUSA advisors to learn more about these grading scales. So we do our research. Don't be afraid if you have a unique grading system at your school or in your region or country. We will learn all about it and be able to provide you with a recalculated GPA that is really a demonstration of what you've been able to achieve in high school. This is particularly important if you've started at a lower secondary and will be graduating from an upper secondary school, or if you've attended multiple upper secondary schools. This recalculation process allows us to, again, find a measure for your GPA that represents all of your great work. What I will say is that GPA is, of course, not the end-all, be-all. So we, of course, are also looking at the curriculum that you've taken, as we shared earlier. We're also going to be looking at the rigor. So at an institution like Richmond, we recalculate your GPA on an unweighted scale, which means that if you are experiencing a curriculum where there are IB classes or AP classes, honors classes, we are not going to more heavily weight certain grades because you've taken those type of classes. We are, of course, are going to look at your rigor. We hope that you have maximized the curriculum that's available to you, that you've challenged yourself, but we look at the rigor as a separate sort of factor from the GPA itself. So as I said, we really want this to be an encouraging kind of takeaway that we will figure it out. We will take this as an opportunity to learn if you are coming from a school that may be unfamiliar to us. And the last measure academically that we're going to be looking for is this idea of test scores. So Jason is going to talk a little bit about the different types of tests and what a standardized test is.
So you primarily have 2 standardized tests. It's the SAT or the ACT. Overseas, SAT is probably going to be the more easily accessible test. But if you do have a chance to either do SAT or ACT, it really doesn't matter which one you pick. Schools don't weigh one over the other. So if you have both tests available to you in your area, it's kind of up to you to decide which one you think you would like to take. There are numerous practice tests online, so you can kind of try those out and see which one maybe you like better. But either one is perfectly fine for most institutions. So the reason that schools require an SAT or an ACT or a standardized test is because it's just another way for schools to determine your academic achievement or your preparedness for entering the university level courses. So some schools have a standard score that they're looking for students to meet, and then some programs might have individual scores that they're looking for. So at UT, we do have a sort of a general area where we're looking for at least a minimum score, but we kind of weigh it against GPA as well, and some schools will do that. But for engineering program, it does require a set score on an ACT or SAT to get into the program. So it's one of those things where you kind of have to, like we've said, go to the websites and see what maybe general score they're looking for, and maybe a program, a more program-based score that you may need to meet in order to enter that program.
Absolutely. So there's definitely a difference between a required minimum score and an average profile. I would say across the board, while not every school will have a minimum, we probably all publish an average admitted student profile, which means you get to see the range of where most admitted students fall for both SAT and ACT. And this gives you a good sense of if your scores are going to be competitive. That's important probably next year more than ever, as many universities in the United States are going test optional. So for some cases, this is a product of COVID-19 and access for students. So for some schools, this will only be a one-year provision for those students that are going to be finishing up their last year of secondary school. And some schools have always been or have been test optional for a long time. So again, looking at that average profile can really help steer your decision about whether or not applying test optional, which means you will not be submitting your official SAT or ACT scores. What do universities look for if you don't submit an SAT or ACT? Well, they're going to be looking more closely at all those other academic measures that we've highlighted today. So they will be looking much more closely at your transcript. They'll be looking more closely at the types of courses that you've taken, the rigor of those courses, to make sure that you're academically prepared to be successful at that school or university. So the other thing, then the question I get asked often is, should I apply test optional? And the answer really has to fall individually to the student. It's a personal decision, but one of the questions that I always encourage students to ask themselves is, first, where do you fall within that profile? The second might be, how did you test that day? Did you have a nice breakfast? Did you get a good night's sleep? Did you feel good when you completed the test? Did you feel like you were prepared for the material? If you feel that it was a good day for you and you did your best and your test was an accurate measure of your academic potential and what you've been able to achieve in secondary school, perhaps you want to include it. And of course, there are always opportunities to retake these tests. It's certainly not required, but in different parts of the world, there may be opportunities to take the test more than once. And most colleges and universities will also super score. So perhaps you did really, really well in verbal your first time around, but not so well in math the second time, vice versa. We're able to take your best verbal score and your best math score and create what we call a super score for you. So test optional is definitely going to be a pathway you'll see with much more frequency than you ever had before in applying to US schools. We know that that was a lot of ground to cover. We're excited to answer your questions. I know we had one question already come in, which was about English proficiency test. So I want to make sure I address that. And that's an important point to mention, that while schools are going test optional for standardized tests, SAT or ACT, they are not going test optional for English proficiency testing. So if English is not your first language, it's important to review the different qualifications to see if you may have to submit an English proficiency test like the TOEFL or the IELTS or Duolingo. Some schools have different provisions. If you've perhaps English is not your first language, but you've been in an English-speaking school for 4 years, they're able to waive that requirement. So this is another, it depends, and important to connect individually with the schools you're looking at. So happy to jump into questions, and here is our contact information too. We are very, very accessible as admission officers. We want to support you on your journey just as Education USA does. So please feel free to follow up with either of us directly if we can help you in any way.
That was so useful. Thank you so much, Amanda and Jason. We really appreciate it. We have a number of questions rolling in here now. So we'll go ahead and we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So we'll kick off with the most popular question right now, which is, what is the main difference between the Common Application and the Coalition Application?
Sure. So that is a great question. I would say the first is probably that Common Application has been around for a little bit longer than the Coalition Application. So I think for that reason, there's perhaps better name recognition, just more students know about Common Application at this point. I think at this point, Common Application still has more universities that are partners, which means there's a larger selection of schools that you can apply to. The Coalition Application has some specifications for us as U.S. universities and schools. We have to meet certain benchmarks as far as access for our students to be able to be members. So there's a little bit of more exclusivity for the schools that can be in Coalition. But from a student perspective, again, Jason kind of alluded to this, there's not a preference between Common App or Coalition, and it's really more about your comfort level beyond anything else.
Perfect, thank you. We've got some questions about how long the application cycle actually takes to complete. So what would you recommend in terms of when to start working on the application? Is there anything you can get done a little bit early, noting the timelines that you suggested earlier?
I would definitely say it's really truly, it depends on the institution. And sometimes this isn't broadcasted. Some schools may not give you a decision until a certain time. So you can just submit your application 3 months early and maybe not get a decision until their actual decision date. So it kind of depends on the institution. It's important to keep in mind that it kind of depends on how the school wants to evaluate what a complete application is. So I would say a lot of it depends on the student submitting everything quickly. Once they start their application, submit everything quickly, and then once you finally submit that last document, that's normally when it triggers someone to start reviewing an application for most schools. So I would say start an application, submit everything as soon as you can, and then normally I would say a lot of schools could probably review in about 2 weeks if they are reviewing currently. But like I said, it depends on the school.
Yeah. And to add on that, so we said that the application typically opens up on August 1st, and usually the earliest deadline for a school that has a hard deadline is going to be November 1st. So that's a couple of months to be working on that. I think while it is not necessary for a student to immediately start to work on it on August 2nd, it might be nice to start to look at applications in those first couple of weeks. Many of our schools are going to have essay requirements. So it's nice to take a peek, look at what sort of essays you may need to be working on in those 2 months in advance of that November 1st deadline. So give yourself some time just to maybe look at the application, think about it, think about some ideas for those essays, and then revisit it at a later time.
Yeah, that's perfect. So again, just in case you're tuning in a little bit late to this session, you should be working on your application in your last year of secondary school or high school in your home country. And I wanted to add a little bit to your responses as well. And one thing that's good to know is that the essay topics tend to become available a little bit earlier in the process, or don't change significantly from year to year as well. So if you're in a situation like right now, New Zealand's on school holidays and Australia's also on school holidays, you can think ahead and look at those essay topics now, and go ahead and start thinking of them, maybe even work on a draft while you're on school holidays. That can be really good use of your time as part of this process too. We'll talk more about that in the next session here. So the next question coming up is actually about school results. And I think we get a lot of questions about this here. And in terms of submitting your final results from schools, and keeping in mind that with the academic calendar in this hemisphere, most results aren't released until late December or even January. So what does that look like for you in terms of your review? Is that important in your decision making, or especially if you're applying early for an institution?
Absolutely. So I can speak to many liberal arts colleges like myself, and Jason, feel free to chime in if it's different for UT. But we typically like to see some indication of your final year progress. So we know that there's going to be a delay to get that final credit for your last transcript, but we'd like to see some sort of in progress result. So we'll reach out to your school counselors to ask for first quarter progress, mid-year progress, whatever it happens to be, whatever sort of kind of official, unofficial results you can give us of how you're looking towards graduation. So at a base level, we like to see certainly what classes you're taking in that final year as we make our decisions, but many of us do like to see some in-progress work as well.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty standard across. I worked at my previous institution was a small regional university, and we did it the exact same way. So normally we would get midterm grades somehow in there, and then we would look at those. And then in some cases, we had students from some countries who didn't have access to those. So we would just look at the previous years. And then once they get their final transcripts, they can submit those.
Okay, perfect. So we have a couple of questions coming through about standardized testing here. So the first one is, what happens if you have a bad transcript or school results, but you have a great SAT or ACT score? Are institutions willing to accept students like this?
Yeah, so that's what we call a lopsided applicant, where one, perhaps they just really shine in one area, but struggle in another. And we understand that not all students can be 1,600 SAT scores and 4.0 students. So I think that there's absolute flexibility for schools to look at students holistically, is a common term that we use, to really recognize their strengths and be sensitive to places where they still have room to improve. Another important thing, particularly if your transcript is an area where you've struggled, there is a section on the application, at least for Coalition and Common Application, for additional information. So this can be a good place where you kind of explain some of the challenges that perhaps you've had. You talk about how math is just a difficult subject, but you connected frequently with your math teacher to try to get a better handle on the material. But certainly feel free to use that space if there are challenges that you want to explain.
Great. And another good question about standardized testing: when should I be taking the SAT or ACT, and how often? How many times?
I would say because it's one of those things where the first time you take it, it could be a little overwhelming. I would say try to take it your junior year, and then try to take it at least one more time before or during your final year in school, because it's always good to at least get that first one out of the way, so you're comfortable with it, you know what to expect, and you never know, you may score excellent on it and not need to take another one. So.
Sure.
But I would say pay attention to their schedules as well, because in some countries they're only offered at certain times. And you can only take it at least 30 days apart anyway. At least here in the US, I don't know how that works overseas, but just try to pay attention to when tests are offered.
Sure. And I think too that it's important to recognize that sometimes there are financial barriers to taking a test multiple times. So we never penalize a student if we see they've only taken it once. If they've taken it once, we will assume that they are, satisfied with those scores. We won't hold it against them because we know that some students don't necessarily have the time or the financial means to take it multiple times. And I think to the other end of that, it's unusual for us to see a student that has taken it more than twice. I think at that point, it's hard to really gain a lot of headway to get your scores to really go beyond what they have achieved after your second go around.
Perfect. And last question, just as we wrap up really quickly, what is the consequence of applying early decision, but then deciding to go elsewhere? I know we signed a contract, but is that really enforceable?
Sure. So the higher education network in the universities in the US is pretty small. So I will tell you that it is very, very common for a student who decides to be maybe tricky or changes their mind that it is often found out. Again, one of the other sort of safeguards against this is that your college counselor is going to be submitting a contract as well. So they'll typically know if you've decided to renege on that contract. Of course, there are also reasons why a student can be released from their contract. The main one being financial need. If they're admitted to a school and it's really beyond their financial means to be able to attend, then on a case-by-case basis, sometimes universities are willing to be flexible with that. But I know that there are universities that will definitely follow up with the student. They will definitely follow up with your college counselor if you have a less than good or pure reason to not enroll at that institution.
Perfect. Thank you all for tuning in to part 1 of our Complete Your Application sessions as part of Education USA Virtual Week. Thanks as well to our U.S. admissions experts, Amanda and Jason, for sharing your expertise with us today. I encourage you all to stay tuned to part 2 of our application sessions, which focuses more on communicating your story as part of the admissions process. If you would like more information on these institutions, please follow our hashtag EducationUSA Virtual Week. Check out our other Education USA Virtual Week sessions by visiting bit.ly/EdUSA Virtual Week Live and register online via the link available on the Facebook event page for additional resources and ongoing support from Education USA. If you have any future questions, please get in touch with your local Education USA Center and visit www.educationusa.state.gov. Thank you so much. Have a good day.